My brother showed up unannounced the morning my son decided to erase me, and the first thing he noticed was that I wasn't living in my own mansion. He asked why. Before I could answer, my son cut me off. "That house belongs to my wife now?" He said it like it was final, like a judge had stamped it, like I was a guest on borrowed land. He had no idea who he was talking to, and he had no idea what my brother was about to see. Before I tell you what happened next, let me say something quietly to every woman watching this. Never assume silence means weakness. Sometimes silence is a woman waiting for the right witness. If you believe dignity should never be mistaken for surrender, stay with me, or please like or subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. Because what unfolded that afternoon changed the way I understood motherhood and power. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 67 years old. I built that house brick by brick alongside my late husband, Richard Whitmore. Every archway, every imported tile, every rose bush along the west garden, I chose them. I paid for half of them. I lived inside those walls for 34 years. And yet that morning I was walking back from the guest house with dirt on my gloves and a basket of cut lavender in my hand. The guest house. It sounds quaint when you say it quickly. In truth, it was a polite exile. I had been temporarily relocated, as my daughter-in-law liked to call it, while they updated the main property. That was 3 months ago. I had told myself it was fine, that family's shift, that space is healthy, that my son Ethan just needed room to feel like the man of the house after his father died. I told myself many things. But the day my brother arrived, the lies I had been telling myself began to crack. Thomas Whitmore does not visit without reason. He is 72, taller than Ethan by a good inch. He moves slowly, deliberately, like a man who has spent decades thinking before speaking. He had been in Chicago finalizing some estate matters, and I assumed he would call before coming. He didn't. I saw his black sedan turn into the driveway just as I stepped out from behind the hedges. He got out, closed the car door gently, and then he froze. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply looked at me and then past me. Behind me stood the small white guest house. In front of him loomed the mansion, and something in his expression shifted. "Maggie," he said carefully, using the childhood name only he still dared to use. "Why are you coming from back there?" I felt the lavender stems press into my palm. "I've been gardening," I answered lightly. He looked at my clothes, then he looked at the main house. "And why?" he asked, voice calm but precise. "Aren't you coming out of your front door?" Before I could form a response, I heard the sliding door from the patio open. Ethan stepped out, arms folded, sunglasses on. That posture I had begun to recognize, the one that meant he was performing adulthood instead of living it. "Uncle Thomas," he called, casual as a man greeting a neighbor. "She stays back there now. It works better for everyone." Thomas did not look at him immediately. Instead, he looked at me, and I did something that shames me even now. I lowered my eyes. That was when Ethan added it. "That house belongs to my wife now." Not loud. Not angry, just declarative, like announcing a weather forecast. Thomas turned his head slowly. "I'm sorry," he asked. Ethan shrugged. "Vanessa and I are running things now. Mom signed the management transfer. It's our home." Our home. Not even his, ours. He had begun speaking in plural months ago. It was subtle at first, then territorial, then final. Thomas removed his sunglasses. He studied the front door, the new security keypad. The landscaping changes Vanessa had insisted on. The new cameras installed at the corners of the property. "When?" Thomas asked evenly. "Did you transfer ownership, Ethan?" "Ownership. That word matters." Ethan smiled slightly. "Ownership is a strong word, but effectively, it's ours." Thomas's gaze flickered toward me again. "Margaret," he said quietly, "did you revoke my secondary authority?" For a moment, I didn't understand the question. Secondary authority. I felt heat creep up my neck. "I don't know what you mean," Ethan laughed. "Oh, come on, Uncle Thomas, don't start with legal technicalities. Dad's gone, we're just modernizing." Modernizing, as if I were an outdated appliance. Thomas nodded slowly. "I see." He did not argue, he did not raise his voice, he did not defend me. And that frightened Ethan more than anger would have, because my brother is never quiet when he is unsure. He is quiet when he is calculating. Vanessa appeared behind Ethan then, hair perfect, linen dress, smile practiced. "Oh, Thomas," she said warmly, "we've just been helping your sister simplify things." The big house was too much for her, too much for me, the woman who designed it. I stood there listening to strangers narrate my own life. Thomas stepped forward. Margaret, he said softly, where are your personal documents kept now? In the guest house, I admitted. Not in your study, my study is being renovated. Ethan cut in, we're turning it into a media office. Of course they were, Thomas nodded again. And the will, it's filed, Ethan replied quickly. Handled. Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. He reached into his coat pocket and removed his phone. I need copies of every document you had her sign, he said calmly. Ethan's smile thinned. You don't trust us? Thomas finally looked at him fully. Trust, he said, is not the same thing as verification. Silence stretched across the driveway. Vanessa shifted her weight. I felt suddenly as though I were watching two chess players mid-game, and I had just realized I didn't know which side I was on. Thomas walked past them toward the main entrance. Ethan stepped sideways, blocking him without quite touching him. You don't need to go in there, he said lightly. We've got everything handled. Thomas stopped. He did not move around him. He did not push. He simply looked down at his nephew the way a senior partner looks at a junior associate who has just made a career-ending mistake. I built that trust structure with your father, Thomas said quietly. Nothing here is handled without my knowledge. Ethan's jaw flickered just slightly, and that was when I realized something chilling. My son didn't actually know everything. He thought he did, but he didn't. Thomas stepped back instead of forward. Fine, he said smoothly. Email me the documents. Vanessa forced a laugh. Of course. Thomas turned to me. I'll stay the night, he said. Ethan opened his mouth, but Thomas added calmly. In the guest house? The words were not a request. They were a declaration. And for the first time in months, I saw uncertainty cross my son's face. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the western trees, Thomas sat across from me at the small kitchen table in the guest house. He asked no emotional questions, only factual ones: dates, signatures, witnesses, language used, who was present, who suggested it. He wrote everything down. Did you feel pressured? He asked finally. I hesitated. Yes. Did you understand the scope of authority you were granting? No. He closed his notebook. Maggie, he said gently, you did not transfer ownership. Relief flickered in my chest, but he continued. You may have triggered something far more serious. The air felt thinner suddenly. What do you mean? Thomas looked toward the mansion through the small guest house window. There are conditions in place, he said carefully. Conditions your husband insisted on? I stared at him. What conditions? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window. Outside, Ethan and Vanessa were hosting friends on the patio. Laughter, wine glasses. Music, they looked comfortable, victorious. Thomas folded his hands behind his back. Let them enjoy tonight, he said softly. Tomorrow I need to verify something. I felt a strange combination of dread and hope twist together inside me. Verify what? Thomas turned toward me slowly. Whether your son just disqualified himself from ever inheriting this house. The words settled heavy between us. Outside, Ethan raised a glass. Inside, my brother began making a call. And I realized the story my son thought was finished had only just begun. The next morning, my son woke up believing he still owned the future. By nightfall, my brother would know whether Ethan had already destroyed it. But before I tell you what Thomas uncovered, you need to understand how I ended up in that guest house in the first place. Because no woman wakes up one morning and simply hands over her life. It happens slowly, politely, with paperwork. I remember the exact afternoon Vanessa found the will. The house still smelled like condolence flowers and furniture polish. Richard had only been gone 3 weeks. I was surviving on tea and routine, answering calls I barely heard, nodding through conversations I did not absorb. Vanessa offered to help organize Richard's study. You shouldn't be alone in here, she said gently, fingertips brushing the edge of his desk like she was honoring something sacred. I mistook proximity for loyalty. That was my first mistake. The study had always been Richard's sanctuary: dark wood shelves, leather-bound binders, neat stacks labeled in his firm handwriting. He was a meticulous man. Order soothed him. Vanessa opened drawers slowly at first, then more quickly, then with curiosity that felt less like help and more like search. I was sorting mail when I heard her say softly, "Oh." It was not grief, it was discovery. She held up a folder. Is this the final estate structure? Yes, I said tiredly. Everything is in place. She flipped through pages, her eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. It's all in your name. That was Richard's decision, I said. For simplicity? She nodded, too quickly. Later that evening, I heard her whispering to Ethan in the hallway. I did not intend to eavesdrop, but grief sharpens your hearing in strange ways. She owns everything, Vanessa murmured. So, Ethan replied, so you don't. Silence. Then her voice again, softer but edged. Do you know how that looks? That was the moment something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a seed planted. After that day, Ethan began asking questions he had never asked before. How much are the property taxes? Why is the investment account structured that way? Why didn't Dad put me on the title? The questions weren't hostile. They were curious, but curiosity has direction, and his was pointing toward entitlement. Vanessa would sit beside him during these conversations, silent but present, eyes fixed on me as though measuring my answers. You don't trust him, she told me one afternoon when Ethan stepped out to take a call. I trust my son, I said evenly, but you don't empower him. That word again, empower. As if authority were something a mother owed her grown child. Richard had always said, inheritance is not a gift, it's a test. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I do now. The document came a month later. Vanessa's father brought it. He arrived in a pressed suit with a leather briefcase and the practiced smile of a man accustomed to being welcomed. This is just temporary management authority, he explained, sliding the papers across my kitchen counter. So Ethan can streamline decision-making. Streamline what? I asked. Renovations, investments, growth. Vanessa stood behind him, hands folded, eyes shining like she was watching a ceremony. Ethan leaned forward. It doesn't change ownership, he said. It just gives me operational control. Operational control, such a sterile phrase. I scanned the first page. There were words like authorization, discretionary authority, restructuring rights. Legal language always sounds harmless when spoken gently. I'd like Thomas to review this, I said carefully. Vanessa's father laughed lightly. With respect, Margaret, involving outside counsel in family matters creates unnecessary tension. Outside counsel. Thomas was not outside anything. He was Richard's brother, but I saw Ethan's jaw tighten. You don't trust me, he said quietly. There it was, the pivot, not logic, emotion. I felt the room shift toward accusation. I trust you, I said softly. I just don't understand this. Vanessa stepped forward then. Daniel, she caught herself and corrected. Ethan feels like he's living under your shadow. He wants to build something of his own. Shadow. My husband had been gone 6 weeks, and I was already a shadow. That night I did not sleep. I walked through the halls of the mansion alone, fingers trailing along walls Richard and I had chosen together. In the study, I sat in his leather chair. The folder lay on the desk. Temporary, that word echoed in my mind. Temporary sacrifice for long-term peace. That's what mothers do, I told myself. We yield small ground to protect the relationship. I signed it the next morning. No shouting, no threats, just my name at the bottom of a page I did not fully understand. And with that ink, the slow relocation began. It started with updates. The master bedroom needed refreshing. My wardrobe was temporarily moved. The study was reimagined. Then came the guest house suggestion. Just while renovations are underway, Vanessa said sweetly, it will be quieter for you. Ethan nodded. You deserve rest. Rest, that is how displacement is disguised. Within 2 weeks, my belongings were boxed with labels I did not write. Within 3, the locks were upgraded for security. Within 4, I needed permission to enter certain rooms. No one said I was unwelcome. They just stopped making space. And because there had been no shouting, no bruises, no obvious cruelty, I convinced myself it wasn't abuse. It was transition. Until the day Thomas arrived and saw the truth in one glance. Back in the guest house that second evening, Thomas sat at the small table reviewing scanned copies Ethan had reluctantly emailed. He read slowly, once, twice, then he leaned back. Maggie, he said quietly, this is not just management authority. My stomach tightened. What is it? It's conditional transfer language disguised as oversight. I stared at him. I never agreed to transfer ownership. You didn't, he said, but you granted authority that can mimic it. Cold crept into my chest. Can I revoke it? He was silent for a moment. Possibly, that word did not comfort me. But, he continued, there's something else. He pulled out his leather portfolio. Inside was a second document, one I had never seen. Richard drafted an additional trust structure 6 months before he passed. My breath caught. He didn't tell me. He didn't want to burden you. Thomas slid the document toward me. Everything flows through a character clause. Character clause, the phrase felt heavy. If Ethan engages in coercion, intimidation, or undue influence, Thomas continued, his access to the estate is suspended indefinitely. I felt dizzy. He would never, Thomas lifted his eyes to mine gently. Maggie, and I knew. It didn't require a raised voice or a strike. Coercion does not always bruise skin, sometimes it signs papers. Outside, I could hear laughter again from the patio. Vanessa's voice carried lightly through the evening air. Thomas closed the folder. I need to verify intent, he said. What does that mean? It means, he replied calmly, if I confirm you signed under pressure, Ethan may have just voided his own future. I swallowed. And if he didn't, Thomas met my gaze steadily, then he still believes he owns something he never truly controlled. He stood, walked toward the window again. They were toasting, celebrating, living as though the house had already changed hands permanently. Thomas folded his hands behind his back. They're playing checkers, he said quietly, and Richard built chess. He turned toward me. Tomorrow, he added, we find out which game your son thinks he's playing. And for the first time since I moved into that guest house, I felt something stronger than shame. I felt the edge of truth approaching. But what Thomas uncovered the next morning was far more deliberate than even I expected. Power doesn't always announce itself with shouting. Sometimes it shows up in small things like a new lock, a moved photograph, a door that no longer opens from your side. The morning after my brother arrived, I watched my son walk through that house like a man who believed the future had already signed his name. He poured coffee in Richard's kitchen, answered calls in Richard's study, spoke to contractors about our vision. There is something unsettling about watching someone rehearse ownership before they've earned it. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look conflicted. He looked settled. That was what frightened me most. Because when a man feels settled in something that isn't truly his, it means he believes the resistance is over. What Ethan didn't know, what Vanessa certainly didn't know, was that my husband never built anything without contingency. And that morning, while my son admired the crown molding as if it had finally answered to him, Thomas was preparing to verify whether Ethan had already disqualified himself. Before I tell you what my brother found in those documents, you need to understand something I didn't understand then. The most dangerous shift in a family is not when a son becomes angry. It's when he becomes certain. And certainty, when it's built on assumption, is a very fragile throne. Thomas was up before sunrise. I heard him moving in the small kitchen of the guest house, the soft scrape of a chair, the low hum of the coffee machine. When I stepped out of my bedroom, he was already dressed, suit pressed, legal pad open, phone beside him. You sleep, he asked. Enough. He studied me for a moment. You ready for honesty? I nodded. He turned the pad around. At the top he had written 3 words: coercion, intent, benefit. These, he said calmly, are what matter. I wasn't threatened, I said automatically. Thomas didn't argue. He simply asked, did you feel free to say no? The question hung there. Did I feel free? I remembered Ethan's jaw tightening. Vanessa's soft voice about empowerment. Her father dismissing Thomas as outside counsel. The subtle implication that refusing meant I didn't believe in my own son. No, I admitted quietly. Thomas nodded once. That's coercion. I exhaled slowly. But he didn't hit me, I added. Thomas's gaze sharpened slightly. Pressure does not need a bruise to qualify. Outside, I heard the sliding patio door open again. Ethan's footsteps. Vanessa's laugh. They were starting another day in a house they believed was theirs. Thomas closed his notebook. I'm going inside. My stomach tightened. You think that's wise? I'm not confronting, he said. I'm observing. There is a difference. He walked toward the main house without hesitation this time. And for the first time since I had been relocated, I followed him, not as a homeowner, but as a witness. The door was unlocked. Vanessa stood in the foyer arranging fresh flowers in a tall glass vase, white lilies, the kind I used to place there every spring. She looked up, surprised to see us enter together. Oh, she smiled brightly. Good morning. Thomas's eyes moved around the foyer slowly. The antique console table Richard restored had been replaced with something minimalist and chrome. My grandfather clock was gone. The family portraits had been reduced to one small frame near the staircase. He noticed everything. Where's the study? He asked evenly. Under renovation, Vanessa replied. And Margaret's bedroom, also being updated. Her tone never cracked, but I saw her fingers tighten around the vase stem. Ethan emerged from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand. Morning, he said. His confidence had returned. Thomas stepped further inside. I need to review the original signed copy of the management agreement. It's digital, Ethan replied quickly. We scanned everything. I prefer originals. Ethan hesitated. For what reason? Thomas met his gaze calmly. For clarity. There it was again, not accusation, not threat, just inevitability. Vanessa stepped closer to Ethan. Uncle Thomas, she began gently, we're trying to move forward. Revisiting paperwork makes things tense. Tension, Thomas replied softly, usually appears when something is unstable. Silence. Ethan's jaw flickered. It's handled, he insisted. Thomas didn't raise his voice. Handled, he repeated, by whom? I'm managing operations now. Under authority granted by your mother. Yes. And you believe that authority supersedes existing trust conditions? The question landed like a stone. Ethan blinked. What trust conditions? Thomas's face did not change, the air did. Vanessa's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. She knew, she had read enough to sense something deeper. Ethan looked between them. What are you talking about? Thomas stepped toward the living room. Sit, he said calmly. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't optional. We gathered in the room Richard and I once hosted holiday dinners in. The furniture was rearranged. The fireplace mantel stripped of half its photos. Thomas remained standing. 6 months before your father passed, he began, he established a secondary trust structure. Ethan frowned. I never heard about that. That was intentional. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. Thomas continued. The estate flows through a character clause. Ethan laughed once. A what? A conditional inheritance mechanism, Thomas clarified. Your access to this property was never automatic. My son's smile faded. That's not legal. It is, Thomas said evenly, and it's enforceable. Vanessa crossed her arms. What kind of condition? Thomas's gaze shifted to me briefly, then back to Ethan. Respectful conduct toward your mother. Ethan's face hardened. I've respected her. Thomas did not react. Have you ever applied pressure regarding asset control? No. The lie was immediate, reflexive. Thomas didn't challenge him yet. He simply asked, did you encourage her to sign documents she did not fully understand? She agreed. Did you create emotional consequences if she refused? Silence. Vanessa spoke instead. We were motivating him to step into leadership. By threatening marital instability? Thomas asked calmly. Ethan's head snapped toward her. What? Thomas slid printed screenshots from his folder onto the coffee table. Vanessa's messages, time-stamped, dated, words about being the man, about not living under his mother, about control. Ethan stared, Vanessa's face drained slightly. You went through my phone? Ethan demanded. No, Thomas said. Your father authorized financial monitoring within the trust. Another silence, this one heavier. Richard had thought further ahead than any of us. Ethan's breathing changed. This is insane, he muttered. You're twisting things. Thomas remained steady. No, Ethan, I'm verifying intent. He stepped closer. Did your mother feel free to say no? Ethan glanced at me. For a split second, I saw something like uncertainty flicker behind his pride. Then it vanished. She overreacts, he said dismissively. She's emotional. The word hit harder than I expected. Thomas's eyes sharpened. Emotion does not invalidate coercion. Ethan stood abruptly. So what? You're saying I lose everything because I pushed a little? Thomas's voice stayed level. I'm saying the clause activates if intimidation or undue influence occurred. Vanessa's composure cracked first. That's ridiculous, she snapped. You can't prove intimidation. Thomas turned slowly toward her. I don't need theatrics, he said quietly. I need pattern. He looked back at Ethan. You relocated her to the guest house. It was temporary. You changed the locks for security. You excluded her from operational decisions. She didn't want to deal with it. Thomas tilted his head slightly. Did she say that? Silence. The kind that stretches. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're blowing this out of proportion. Thomas stepped back. Perhaps. He gathered the papers calmly, but understand something very clearly. He paused. If the clause is triggered, your authority dissolves immediately. Vanessa swallowed. What does that mean? It means, Thomas replied, voice soft but unmistakably firm, you are not managing this house. He let the next words fall slowly. You are residing in it on borrowed time. The room felt smaller, the morning light suddenly colder. Ethan's confidence had not vanished yet, but it had cracked. You wouldn't do that, he said finally. Thomas held his gaze. I wouldn't have to. He turned toward me. Maggie, I'll need a written statement. My heart pounded. A statement? About how you felt when signing. Ethan looked at me sharply. You're really doing this? That question, it wasn't angry. It was disbelieving, like he never imagined I would choose structure over silence. I felt Richard's absence in that moment more than ever, but I also felt something else. Clarity. I'm telling the truth, I said quietly. Ethan shook his head. You're overreacting. Thomas spoke before I could. No, he said, she's documenting. Vanessa's voice softened suddenly. We can fix this, she said quickly. There's no need for escalation. Thomas gave her a long, measured look. Escalation, he said, began the moment she stopped sleeping in her own bedroom. Silence again, heavy, final. He walked toward the door. I'll be making calls, he said calmly. You'll be hearing from counsel. Ethan stepped forward. You're trying to ruin me. Thomas paused at the threshold. No, he said quietly. You're trying to inherit something you never qualified for. And with that, he stepped outside. I followed him. The door closed behind us. For the first time in months, the mansion felt uncertain. Not to me, to them. Thomas didn't speak as we crossed the driveway back toward the guest house. When we reached the door, he finally said, They still think this is about paperwork. I swallowed. It's not. He looked back at the mansion. No, his voice lowered. It's about character. He turned to me fully. And your son is about to learn the difference between access and ownership. Inside the main house, I could see Ethan pacing, Vanessa close behind him, whispering, calculating. They were no longer celebrating, they were strategizing. And what they didn't yet realize was that Richard had already planned for that too. Tomorrow, Thomas would trigger the review, and once that review began, there would be no quiet way out. The next afternoon, my son hosted a toast in my living room. Crystal glasses, catered trays, laughter that didn't belong to the walls. Vanessa had invited neighbors, 2 of Ethan's business contacts, and most painfully 3 women from my old garden club. Women who had once sat at my dining table now stood near my fireplace sipping champagne, while my daughter-in-law accepted compliments about her beautiful home. I stood in the guest house window and watched strangers admire the crown molding I had chosen 22 years ago. They're making it public, Thomas said quietly beside me. What does that mean? It means they believe it's already theirs. I felt something settle inside me then, not panic, not fear, finality. Thomas checked his watch. Good, he murmured, good. Before I could ask what he meant, a black SUV turned slowly into the driveway. Then another, no flashing lights, no drama, just quiet authority. Vanessa noticed first. I saw her smile falter through the living room window. Ethan stepped toward the front door as 2 men in tailored suits exited the first vehicle. Behind them, a uniformed deputy stepped out of the second. Guests turned. Glasses paused midair. What's happening? One woman whispered. Thomas didn't rush. He walked across the lawn toward the main entrance with the calm of a man arriving at a scheduled appointment. I followed, not behind him, beside him. When we stepped onto the porch, Ethan opened the door halfway, confusion sharpening into irritation. What is this? He demanded. Thomas handed him a sealed envelope. Formal notice, he said evenly. Vanessa appeared over Ethan's shoulder, face pale but composed. This is not the time, she said softly, glancing at their guests. It's exactly the time, Thomas replied. The deputy stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, he said to Ethan, we're here to supervise a trust enforcement order. The word enforcement sliced through the room. Guests began setting down their glasses. Vanessa's father, who had been standing near the kitchen island, stepped forward quickly. Excuse me, he said sharply, this is a private residence. Thomas looked at him with measured patience. It is, he agreed. And it belongs to my sister. Silence. The deputy cleared his throat. Under Section 14 of the Whitmore Trust structure, he read calmly, authority granted under secondary management agreement is hereby suspended pending investigation of coercive influence. Vanessa's eyes darted to Ethan. What does that mean? She whispered. Thomas answered for him. It means, he said, voice low but clear enough for every guest to hear, that effective immediately, Ethan no longer has operational authority over this property. The room shifted. You could feel it like a chandelier swaying after a tremor. That's ridiculous, Ethan snapped. She signed it. Yes, Thomas said evenly. Under documented emotional pressure. That's a lie, Thomas didn't argue. He simply nodded toward the men behind him. Locks will be reset this afternoon. Vanessa inhaled sharply. You can't just storm in here. We're not storming, Thomas replied calmly. We're restoring. Guests began gathering purses discreetly. One of the business contacts slipped toward the door without making eye contact with Ethan. Vanessa's father stepped closer to Thomas. You're humiliating your own nephew. Thomas held his gaze. No, he said softly. He humiliated himself. The deputy spoke again. Mr. Whitmore, you and your wife are permitted to gather personal belongings today. You will have 48 hours to vacate pending final review. The word vacate landed like a dropped plate. Ethan stared at me then, not at Thomas. At me. You did this, he said, voice trembling between anger and disbelief. I didn't flinch. I told the truth, I answered quietly. That was all. Vanessa's composure cracked next. You're tearing this family apart, she hissed. Thomas stepped slightly forward, not aggressively but firmly. No, he corrected. The clause exists because Richard anticipated this possibility. The mention of his father's name seemed to knock something loose inside Ethan. Dad wouldn't have done this, he muttered. Thomas's voice softened just a fraction. Your father built safeguards, he said, not punishments. The locksmith moved past us into the foyer, methodical, professional, not emotional. The first click of metal tools echoed louder than any shouting could have. Guests began filing out quietly, murmuring apologies about poor timing and misunderstandings. Vanessa stood frozen near the staircase. Ethan paced, jaw clenched, breathing uneven. Say something, he demanded of me. Fix this. For years I had rushed to fix his discomfort, to soften his mistakes, to absorb his anger, but something inside me had shifted the moment Thomas stepped onto that porch. I am fixing it, I said gently. The locksmith removed the keypad panel, unscrewed the brass lock, replaced it. The sound was almost delicate. Final. Thomas turned toward the deputy. Interior study access needs to be restored immediately, he said. The deputy nodded. Vanessa laughed once, thin and brittle. You planned this, she said to Thomas. Yes, he answered without apology. Ethan's voice rose. You're choosing her over me. Thomas looked at him steadily. I'm choosing integrity. Silence spread again. He turned toward me then. Maggie, he said softly, would you like to re-enter your home? The question felt enormous. Guests were nearly gone now, the living room half empty. Vanessa standing near the staircase like someone who had miscalculated a bet. I stepped forward, not quickly, not triumphantly, just steadily. The locksmith stepped aside. The deputy nodded respectfully. I crossed the threshold. The air felt different, still familiar, but waiting. Vanessa's floral arrangement sat in the foyer. I picked it up calmly, carried it to the side table, set it down without comment. Ethan watched me like he was seeing someone new. Where are we supposed to go? He demanded. Thomas answered before I could. You'll figure it out. The deputy handed Ethan a printed copy of the order. He scanned it, hands shaking slightly. Vanessa's father approached her quietly. We'll call our attorney, he whispered. Thomas overheard. Of course, he said calmly. You're welcome to. The locksmith moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The sound of another lock turning echoed through the house. I felt something loosen in my chest, not revenge, not satisfaction, relief. Thomas leaned slightly closer to me. They thought this was about space, he murmured. I nodded faintly. It was about boundaries. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Ethan stood very still in the center of the living room. For the first time since Richard died, he looked uncertain, not defiant, not arrogant, just unsure. And uncertainty is where growth begins or collapse. Vanessa stepped toward him quietly. "We'll handle this," she whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. The final lock clicked into place. The locksmith handed the new key to me, cold metal in my palm, solid, undeniable. The deputy cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "property authority has been reinstated." Reinstated. Not given, not transferred. Reinstated. Thomas folded the enforcement order and slipped it into his briefcase. "This isn't over," Ethan muttered. Thomas looked at him evenly. "No," he agreed. "It's just begun." Ethan's eyes flicked to me again, something unspoken there, a question, a plea he didn't know how to voice. But I didn't rush to fill the silence. For once, I let it sit. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is stop explaining herself. As the sun dipped lower, guests gone and authority restored, I stood in the foyer of my own home and realized something unexpected. The house hadn't changed, I had. And upstairs in the study Richard once called his war room, a folder still waited in Thomas's briefcase. One Ethan had not yet seen. One that would decide whether this was simply eviction or permanent disqualification. And my son still believed this was only about locks. Ethan thought the humiliation was the punishment. He thought being told to vacate in front of guests was the consequence. He didn't understand something critical. The locks changing were not the verdict. They were the warning. The real decision was still sitting in Thomas's briefcase. And that decision had my husband's handwriting on it. That evening, after the locksmiths left and the deputy completed his walkthrough, the house felt unfamiliar again, but this time not because I had been pushed out. It felt like a place holding its breath. Vanessa and Ethan were upstairs packing. I could hear drawers sliding open, closet doors shutting harder than necessary, the low hiss of whispered arguments. Thomas sat in the restored study Richard's study at the heavy oak desk. He had placed the leather folder in front of him but had not opened it yet. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. "You're waiting," I said quietly. "Yes, for what?" "For them to realize this isn't about embarrassment." I stepped inside slowly. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. My books were stacked unevenly along the shelves. The rug had been rolled halfway back, as if renovation plans had paused mid-sentence. Thomas finally opened the folder. Inside was the secondary trust document Richard had drafted 6 months before his death. I had seen pieces of it. But not all. "This," Thomas said gently, tapping the final section, "is what Ethan never read." I walked closer. There, beneath the character clause language, was a subprovision. Clear, precise. Irrevocable amendment in the event of sustained coercion or removal of primary beneficiary from residence. My breath caught. "Removal from residence?" I whispered. Thomas nodded. "If it's determined that you were displaced through emotional manipulation, his inheritance rights don't just pause. They what? They terminate." The word seemed too heavy to belong in that room. Terminate, as in, ended permanently. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Ethan appeared in the doorway, a suitcase in hand. Vanessa behind him, face tight with controlled fury. "What are you talking about?" Ethan demanded. Thomas did not close the folder. He turned it so Ethan could see. "You've triggered escalation." "I moved her temporarily," Ethan snapped. "She agreed." Thomas's voice stayed steady. "Did she request relocation?" Silence. Vanessa answered instead. "She said it was fine." Thomas didn't look at her. "I asked if she requested it." Ethan's grip tightened on the suitcase handle. "She didn't fight it." There it was, the logic of entitlement. If she didn't fight, she consented. Thomas leaned back slightly. "Silence under pressure," he said calmly, "is not consent, it's survival." Vanessa stepped forward sharply. "You're twisting this." Thomas met her gaze evenly. "No," he said. "Your husband did." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "So what? You're saying I lose everything?" Thomas didn't soften it. "I'm saying the trust is structured to protect Margaret from sustained coercion. Displacement qualifies." Vanessa's composure cracked. "This is absurd. She's standing right there. She looks fine." I finally spoke. "I wasn't fine." My voice surprised even me. It wasn't loud, but it didn't tremble either. Ethan looked at me sharply. "You never said you weren't." "I didn't think I had to." The air shifted. Thomas closed the folder gently. "Ethan," he said, "you were given conditional access to a future. Not entitlement to it." Ethan's face flushed red. "I'm your son," he said to me. "Yes," I replied quietly. You are, and you're choosing paperwork over me. I felt Richard's absence like a shadow at my shoulder. I'm choosing peace over fear, I said. Vanessa scoffed softly. Fear of him? Thomas answered before I could. Fear of losing dignity. Silence again, heavy, unavoidable. Ethan dropped the suitcase upright on the floor. So what happens now? Thomas stood. Now, he said calmly, the trust review board meets. Ethan blinked. The what? Richard appointed 2 additional trustees beyond myself. My stomach tightened. You never told me that. You didn't need to know unless this happened. Vanessa's eyes widened. Who? An independent estate attorney, Thomas replied, and a financial auditor. Ethan stared at him. You're serious? I always am. The implications settled slowly over the room. This wasn't a family disagreement. It was a structural evaluation. Vanessa's voice dropped lower. If they rule against him, Thomas didn't hesitate. He forfeits inheritance permanently? The word permanent hung there like a verdict already spoken. Ethan's bravado thinned visibly. You wouldn't let that happen, he said to me, softer now. The old instinct flickered inside me to reassure, to protect, to smooth, but I remembered the guest house. The closed doors, the feeling of being gently erased. I don't control it anymore, I said, and that was true. Richard had ensured that. Vanessa stepped closer to Ethan. We'll fight it, she whispered. Thomas's expression didn't change. You're welcome to present your case. Ethan looked between us. So I'm on trial now, Thomas answered quietly. You put yourself there? Silence settled once more, this time not tense. Final, Vanessa picked up the suitcase. Let's go, she said. Ethan hesitated in the doorway. For a split second, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would hover at the edge of a room, unsure whether he was in trouble. But this wasn't childhood. This was consequence. He left without another word. The front door closed behind them. The house grew quiet. Thomas remained standing in the study. You didn't have to escalate to termination, I said softly. He turned to me. I didn't, he replied. Richard did. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. Ethan's car sat there, engine idling for a long moment before pulling away. Vanessa didn't look back. He did, just once. Then they were gone. Thomas closed the folder carefully and locked it inside his briefcase. The review meets in 48 hours, he said, and if they uphold termination, he met my eyes. Then your son loses more than a house. The weight of that settled deep, not because of money, but because inheritance is identity, and Richard had built identity into the clause. Do you regret it? Thomas asked gently. I thought about the guest house, the way I'd learned to shrink inside my own life, the way Ethan had begun speaking as if ownership equaled authority over me. No, I said quietly, I regret waiting. Thomas gave a small nod. That's growth. We stood in silence for a moment. The sun had dipped lower again, golden light spilling across the study floor. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel like contested territory. It felt like truth. But downstairs, near the foyer table, an envelope had arrived during the commotion. Thomas hadn't opened it yet. Neither had I. It bore Ethan's handwriting. And whatever was inside it would determine whether this story ended in separation or something far more complicated. The envelope was not dramatic. No bold ink, no angry scrawl, just my name, written carefully, like he had slowed himself down to make it steady. Thomas noticed it before I did. It was resting against the foyer table leg, half hidden by the baseboard, as if someone had pushed it through the crack beneath the door. He came back, Thomas said quietly. I didn't need to ask who. My hand hovered over the envelope for a moment before picking it up. It was light, too light to hold everything that had happened between us. You don't have to read it tonight, Thomas added, but I did. Because unfinished words have a way of growing teeth in the dark. We sat in the living room. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in months, not tense, not occupied, just quiet. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single page. No legal language, no accusations, just Ethan. Mom, I didn't know about the termination clause. Uncle Thomas made it sound like I already ruined everything. Maybe I did. I didn't think moving you to the guest house would count as something that serious. I thought you understood it was temporary. Vanessa said it would help us build something stable. I believed her. I believed I had to take control or I'd look weak. I never wanted to lose you over a house. I just didn't want to feel like a child in my own life. I'm asking you to talk to the trustees before they decide. Please don't let Dad's last memory of me be this. Ethan, the paper trembled slightly in my hands. Thomas didn't interrupt. He waited. What do you hear? He asked gently. I read it again. I hear regret, I said slowly. And justification. Thomas nodded once. He's still explaining himself. Yes, I folded the letter carefully. He wants me to intervene. He does. The trust review was scheduled for the next morning, 2 independent trustees joining Thomas at the downtown office Richard had used for estate planning. If termination was upheld, Ethan's inheritance rights would be permanently revoked. Not paused, not delayed, revoked, and no court could undo Richard's original structure. That night I didn't sleep much, not because I was torn, but because I was thinking, there's a difference. For months I had reacted to pressure, to guilt, to performance. Now, for the first time, I had space to think without anyone standing over me. Ethan didn't want to lose me. But had he been afraid of losing me when he moved me out of my bedroom? Had he feared my absence when he installed new locks? Or had he assumed I would always remain, no matter how small my corner became? Morning came quietly. Thomas dressed without speaking. I won't ask you to attend, he said gently. I will, I replied. He studied me carefully. You're sure? Yes. Because if my son's future was being weighed, I would not hide from it. The trustee office was neutral and cold in a way only legal spaces can be. Beige walls, frosted glass, the faint smell of polished wood and paper. The independent trustees were already seated when we entered. Mr. Calder, the estate attorney Richard had trusted for decades, and Miss Reynolds, the financial auditor assigned to monitor compliance. Both in their 60s, both calm, both serious. Ethan sat alone at the opposite end of the table. Vanessa was not there. That told me more than any letter could. He looked smaller without her beside him, less rehearsed. He stood when I entered. Mom, he said quietly. I nodded. We all took our seats. Mr. Calder began. This review concerns potential activation of Clause 14B of the Whitmore Trust, he said formally. Specifically, termination of inheritance rights due to sustained coercion or displacement of the primary beneficiary. The language was clinical. Precise, emotionally sterile. Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Reynolds addressed me directly. Do you confirm that you were relocated from your primary bedroom to the guest house under pressure? Yes, I answered. Did you feel free to refuse? No, Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Mr. Calder turned to him. Mr. Whitmore, do you dispute that your mother felt pressured? Ethan swallowed. I didn't think she felt that way, he said. That wasn't the question, Mr. Calder replied calmly. Ethan hesitated. No, he admitted finally. Silence settled over the table. Miss Reynolds made a note. Were you aware, Mr. Calder continued, that relocation of the primary beneficiary without her explicit request could trigger Clause 14B? No. Did you seek legal clarification before implementing authority changes? No. Did you encourage the beneficiary to sign documents granting you management control? Yes. The admissions were coming now. Slow but clean, Mr. Calder leaned back slightly. The clause is not designed to punish, he said evenly. It is designed to protect. Ethan looked at me then. Mom, I never meant to hurt you. I held his gaze. I know. The trustees exchanged a glance. Miss Reynolds spoke next. Intent mitigates perception, she said, but impact governs enforcement. There it was, impact, not excuses, not emotional context. Impact. Mr. Calder folded his hands. Given the confirmed displacement and admission of applied pressure, Clause 14B qualifies for activation. Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly. But, Mr. Calder continued, termination is not automatic. Ethan looked up sharply. Thomas remained still. The clause permits discretionary review based on remedial accountability, Miss Reynolds explained. In simple terms, whether corrective action and genuine responsibility are demonstrated. Ethan's eyes flicked to mine. This was the opening he wanted. The chance for me to step in, to soften, to rescue. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Calder said carefully, the trust allows you to submit a personal recommendation. The room grew very still. Ethan's breath caught. Thomas didn't look at me. He knew better. This wasn't his moment. It was mine. I felt the weight of the past months press against my ribs. The guest house, the silence, the subtle shrinking, but I also felt something else. Clarity. My son, I said slowly, made choices that hurt me. Ethan's eyes dropped. He acted from insecurity, I continued, not malice. Thomas's jaw shifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He displaced me, I said, but he did not abandon me. The trustees listened carefully. I do not want termination, I finished. Ethan's head snapped up. Relief flooded his face too quickly. But I added firmly, I want consequence. The relief froze. What kind? Mr. Calder asked. I turned toward Ethan fully. You will not have automatic inheritance. He stiffened. You will not control any property structure. His jaw tightened again. You will attend financial ethics counseling, I continued steadily. And you will live independently for a minimum of 2 years without relying on trust resources. Silence. Miss Reynolds wrote quickly. If those conditions are met, I said calmly, access can be reconsidered. Mr. Calder nodded slowly. That aligns with discretionary rehabilitation under Clause 14b. Ethan looked stunned. You're putting me on probation? He asked quietly. No, I replied. I'm giving you a path. Thomas exhaled softly beside me. The trustees conferred quietly for several minutes. Then Mr. Calder spoke. Termination is suspended. Conditional probationary status is enacted. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not victory, not defeat, suspension. The word felt balanced. Fair. This review will be revisited in 24 months, Miss Reynolds added. The meeting adjourned quietly. Chairs scraped softly. Folders closed. No applause, no dramatic collapse, just structured consequence. Ethan lingered near the door as the trustees left. Why didn't you just end it? He asked me quietly. I met his gaze. Because ending things is easy. He swallowed. And this, I said calmly, is harder. Thomas stepped toward the hallway. We'll speak later, he told Ethan. Ethan nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't perform. For the first time in months, he looked reflective. As we exited the building, Thomas glanced at me. You surprised me, he admitted. I surprised myself, I replied. The sun was bright outside. Clear, unforgiving. Ethan stood by the curb for a moment before walking toward his car. He didn't ask to come home. He didn't demand reversal. He just stood there, quieter than I'd ever seen him. And for the first time since this began, I realized something important. He wasn't afraid of losing the house anymore. He was afraid of losing me. But whether he understood what that truly meant would depend on what he did next. The first night I slept in my bedroom again, I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the doorway for a long time, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to feel the difference. For 3 months, I had told myself I was being patient. That relocation was temporary. That yielding space was maturity. But standing there in the quiet of my own room, I finally admitted something no one teaches women to say out loud. When you shrink to keep the peace never stays. The house was silent now. No Vanessa's heels clicking across marble. No Ethan pacing during late-night phone calls. No whispering outside closed doors, just air, still and honest. Thomas had stayed through the trust review, but that evening he returned to his hotel downtown to give me space. Before leaving, he stood in the foyer and studied me the way older brothers do when they're measuring strength. You don't look shaken, he said. I'm not, I replied. He nodded slowly. Good, because this is the quiet part. The quiet part, he didn't mean calm, he meant reflection. After he left, I walked through the house alone, not inspecting. Reclaiming, the living room furniture still sat in Vanessa's arrangement. Minimalist, cold, nothing layered. I didn't change it, not yet. I moved toward the study instead. Richard's study. The desk had been cleared of their media office plans. The oak surface bare again. I placed my hand flat against it. Solid, grounded, and for the first time in months I didn't feel like a guest in my own life, but peace is not immediate. It is practiced. At 9:47 that night my phone vibrated. Ethan, I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Hello? Silence for a moment on the other end, then, are you alone? Yes. A breath. I drove by, he admitted. I glanced toward the darkened window. Why? I needed to see if the lights were on. The vulnerability in his voice was unfamiliar. Why does that matter? I asked calmly. Another pause. Because if they were off, it would mean you weren't there. There it was, not entitlement, not anger, fear. I'm here, I said, more silence than it feels strange. Yes, I keep thinking I should be upstairs in my room. I let that sentence sit. You're not a child anymore, I said gently. I know, but his tone said he didn't. I didn't realize how much I assumed, he added quietly. Assumed what? That it would always be mine. The honesty surprised me. Inheritance creates illusions when not understood. I was raised there, he continued. I thought that meant something. It does, I said softly, but not ownership. He exhaled slowly. Vanessa left. The words landed without drama. When, this afternoon, I didn't react. She said she needs stability, he continued. And that uncertainty isn't attractive. The phrasing told me everything, attractive as if security were aesthetic. And what do you need? I asked him. A long pause. I don't know, he admitted. That answer felt more real than anything he'd said in months. I thought being in control would make me feel secure, he went on. But when Uncle Thomas laid everything out, I realized I didn't even understand what I was controlling. The conversation wasn't heated. It wasn't emotional, it was stripped down. I don't hate you, he said suddenly. I know, but you look at me differently now. Yes. The word didn't shake, it didn't accuse, it simply existed. Like what? Like a man responsible for his choices. Silence again. I don't know how to earn that back, he said. That's not my job to map out, I replied calmly. He didn't argue, that was new. You didn't end the trust, he said finally. No, why? I thought about it. Because consequences teach better than abandonment. He inhaled slowly. I'm scared, he admitted, that word mattered. What are you scared of? I asked. Failing without a safety net. For months, he had mistaken the house for security. Now he understood it was structure, and structure had conditions. You're not losing me, I said carefully, but you're losing access. The distinction seemed to land. That feels worse, he muttered. Because access is easy, I said. Relationship is work. Silence. Then softer, can I come by tomorrow? I didn't answer immediately. Boundaries are strongest when not rushed. For what purpose? I asked. To talk. Not to negotiate. No, not to argue. No, then yes. Another breath on the line. Thank you. After we hung up, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. There is a difference. The next afternoon, Ethan stood at the front door, not with luggage, not with demands, just himself. I opened it. He didn't step in immediately. Can I? He asked. Yes. He walked inside slowly, looking around like someone entering a museum of his own childhood. It looks the same, he murmured. It always did. We sat in the living room. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. I keep replaying it, he admitted. What part? The moment Uncle Thomas said borrowed time. His jaw tightened. I thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. I know, he rubbed his hands together. I don't want to be on probation forever. Then don't be, he looked up. How? Stop thinking about inheritance, I said evenly. Start thinking about integrity. He let that sit. I thought proving I could run things would make Dad proud. Your father valued restraint more than control. Ethan looked down. I never understood that. No, I agreed. You didn't. Silence again, but not tense, just reflective. I'm applying for a position out of state, he said suddenly. I didn't react. I need to build something without leaning on this place. That was the first independent thought I'd heard from him in months. That sounds healthy, I said. He nodded slowly. I don't want to feel like I'm circling your driveway anymore. The honesty was raw. Good, I replied. He stood then, no hug, no dramatic reconciliation, just a nod. I'll call you, he said. I'll answer, I replied. He walked out without turning back, and as the door closed, I realized something important. He didn't ask when the trust review would reconsider him. He didn't ask what boxes he still had access to. He didn't ask about money, he asked how to rebuild character. That is where restoration begins, but restoration is not immediate. It takes time. And upstairs in the study, the final addendum of Richard's trust still contained one more condition Ethan had not yet asked about. A condition that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with who he would become. He thought probation was the hardest part. He hadn't yet discovered what full accountability required. 2 weeks after Ethan told me he was applying for work out of state, I found the final addendum in Richard's trust. Not because Thomas pointed it out, not because Ethan asked about it, but because I finally had the quiet to read everything my husband left behind. It was late afternoon. Sunlight spilled across the study floor in long gold stripes, and the house felt settled, like it had stopped bracing for impact. Thomas had come by to drop off a few updated documents from the trust review. He placed them neatly on Richard's desk and lingered, watching me scan through the pages. "You're looking for something," he observed. "I am," he nodded toward the open binder. "Page 42? I flipped to it. There it was, a short clause, no dramatic legal language, no bold print, just one line, almost understated. Full restoration of beneficiary access is contingent upon demonstrated independent stability and voluntary restitution of displaced dignity. I read it twice. Voluntary restitution of displaced dignity, I repeated softly. Thomas folded his arms. He wrote that part himself. I smiled faintly. That sounds like Richard. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about control, it was about acknowledgement, not forced apology, not technical compliance. Voluntary restitution? That's not measurable, I said quietly. It is, Thomas replied. You'll know it when you see it. He left shortly after, giving me the silence to sit with the words, restitution of displaced dignity. For months, I had thought dignity was something someone could take from me. But sitting there alone in that room, I realized something deeper. Dignity leaves when we allow it to, and returns when we stop negotiating it. 3 months passed. Ethan moved to Denver. He took a mid-level operations job at a logistics firm, nothing glamorous, nothing inherited. He rented a small apartment. Sent no requests for funds, no passive questions about the trust. Just occasional updates. Work is harder than I thought. I had to redo a presentation 3 times. My boss doesn't care who my father was. Each message was shorter than the one before, less defensive, more grounded. Vanessa filed for legal separation within the first month. I didn't ask Ethan how he felt about it. If pain was part of his accountability, I wouldn't soften it. But he called one evening, his voice quieter than usual. She said I wasn't ambitious enough without the house. I listened. That must hurt, I said. It does. Silence. Then maybe she was right. Or maybe she married potential she thought was guaranteed, I replied calmly. He didn't respond immediately. I'm starting to see the difference, he admitted, between love and leverage. He didn't say it, but he understood. 6 months later, he came home for Thanksgiving. Not because he assumed he belonged, but because he asked, "May I visit?" He had texted. Yes, he arrived without fanfare, no expensive gifts, no attempt to impress, just a small overnight bag. He stood at the doorway the same way he had months earlier, waiting. I opened it. "You look tired," I said. "I've been working." "That's good." He stepped inside slowly. This time there was no tension, no cameras, no rearranged furniture. The house felt like itself again. Dinner was quiet, not awkward. Just honest. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down. "There's something I need to say," he began. I didn't rush him. He inhaled slowly. "I took from you, not the house, not the money, something else." "Go on," I said gently. "I made you feel small in your own home." The words didn't come easily. They came deliberately. "That wasn't just pressure," he continued. "It was arrogance. There it was, voluntary, unprompted, not because a trustee demanded it. Not because a clause required it, but because he saw it. I can't undo that," he said quietly. "No," I replied, "but I can acknowledge it." Silence settled softly between us. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small envelope. "I paid for the guest house renovations to be reversed," he said. "I know you said it was fine, but it wasn't supposed to be your home." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "I hired a contractor. He's coming next week to restore it to its original design. Not as an extension, not as exile, but as what it was meant to be, a guest house. Not my displacement, restitution. Not demanded, offered." My throat tightened slightly. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I did." There it was, voluntary restitution of displaced dignity. Thomas's words echoed in my mind. "You'll know it when you see it." I saw it, not in the envelope, not in the gesture, but in the absence of performance. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying to repair. After dinner, he stood in the doorway of the study. "Can I come in?" he asked. Yes, he stepped inside slowly, looking at the desk. "I used to think this room meant power," he admitted. "What does it mean now?" I asked. "Responsibility." He turned toward me. "I don't expect the trust to change." "It may," I said calmly. He shook his head. "That's not why I'm doing this." And that was the difference. Later that evening, as he prepared to leave for his hotel downtown, he paused at the front door. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quietly. I just want to be someone you respect. The words were simple, unadorned, and truer than any legal argument he had made months before. Respect, I said gently, is earned through consistency. He nodded. I'm learning. After he left, I walked back into the house and stood in the foyer, the same place where he once declared it belonged to his wife. The same place where locks were changed. The same place where I felt erased. Now it felt still, balanced. I walked upstairs to the study and opened the trust binder again, the clause about termination, the probationary period. The restitution requirement, all of it intact, but something inside me had shifted. Inheritance was no longer the center of this story. Character was. The next morning I called Thomas. I think he's ready, I said. For review, he asked. For restoration? Thomas was quiet for a moment. You're certain? Yes. There was no hesitation in my voice, not because I was soft, but because I was clear. 2 years later, when the trustees formally reinstated Ethan's conditional beneficiary status, there was no celebration. No champagne, no public toast, just paperwork and peace. He never asked for control again. He built his own life, visited as a guest, sat at my table as a son, not an heir. And every time he stepped through the front door, he did something small but telling. He paused, waited for me to enter first, not because I demanded it, but because he understood. The house was never the lesson. Power was. And he finally learned the difference between owning something and deserving it. That day he made his bold claim. He thought he was speaking to a widow. He forgot he was speaking to a Whitmore. And dignity, once restored, does not leave quietly again.